My name is Reese Harmon. I am 31 years old, and on the night my family threw me a welcome home party, I discovered that the most dangerous ambush does not happen on a battlefield. It happens in your mother's living room, underneath red, white, and blue streamers, while someone is cutting a sheet cake with your name written in yellow frosting. I had been back on American soil for 11 days when it happened. 11 days after stepping off a transport plane from Bagram, still adjusting to the way American air smelled different, the way grocery store lighting felt too bright, the way silence in a Georgia suburb carried a different weight than silence in Kandahar province. Kyle had organized the whole thing, my older brother by 4 years. He had posted about it on Facebook 3 days before, standing in my mother's kitchen looking proud of himself, proud to welcome home my little sis after her service to this great nation. Heart emoji, flag emoji, 47 comments, 112 likes. He did not mention that 2 weeks before I landed, I had called him from a base in Germany, asking why my savings account showed a balance of $214 instead of the $63,000 I had been accumulating over 15 months of deployment pay, hazard pay, and combat zone tax exclusions. He told me not to panic. He said there were complications. He said we would talk when I got home. I was home now, and I had brought something to talk about. Before I tell you what was inside the black nylon bag I set under my chair that evening, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels tonight, because what I am about to tell you is not only about money. It is about what some people believe they are owed by the ones who sacrifice so they never have to. My name is Reese Harmon, and I served 7 years in the United States Army as a military police officer. I completed 2 tours in Afghanistan. The first was 13 months. The second was 15. I grew up outside of Macon, Georgia, the kind of small town where everyone knew your business before you did, where girls were expected to marry young and stay within driving distance of their mothers. My mother, Diane, believed joining the military was something boys did when they could not think of anything better. My brother Kyle, 4 years older and already deep in a career, selling real estate to people who could not quite afford what he was showing them, thought it was something I was doing to embarrass him. My grandmother, Ruth Harmon, was the only person who came to my enlistment ceremony. She wore her church hat, the wide-brimmed blue one with the silk flower she reserved for occasions that truly mattered. She cried when I raised my right hand and took the oath. Afterward, she made me a plate of biscuits and honey, sat across from me at her kitchen table, and told me she had never been more proud of anyone in her life. She said I had more courage in my left hand than most people carried in their whole bodies. I held on to that sentence for 7 years, on long nights in Kandahar, on convoys I will not describe in detail, on the morning after the hardest day of my second deployment, when I sat in the dark of my bunk and tried to remember who I was before I put on a uniform. The Army taught me many things. How to stay calm when everything around you is loud and dangerous. How to observe before reacting. How to document. How to build a case from evidence rather than emotion. How to follow procedures under pressure, and how to identify precisely when someone else is not following theirs. Those skills are the only reason I was sitting in that living room in Macon, Georgia on a September evening, with a carefully organized accordion folder in a black nylon bag under my chair, instead of nothing. I need to tell you what they did while I was gone. Not the version that makes them look confused or overwhelmed. The version with dates, amounts, and documents. Before my second deployment, I sat at my mother's kitchen table and walked through everything with Kyle. He had offered to manage things while I was overseas. He said he did not want me carrying the weight of home while I was serving. He said family looks out for each other. I gave him a limited power of attorney for financial emergencies only. I defined the word emergency in writing. I listed the specific conditions under which account access was permitted. I wrote the restrictions clearly, had him sign a copy, and kept mine in a fireproof lockbox at my apartment. I told him the savings account was not to be touched under any circumstances. That money was for when I came home. I was planning to buy a small house, something quiet, something with a yard big enough for a dog. Kyle nodded and said he understood. He did not. Over the following 15 months, Kyle accessed my savings account 9 separate times. The withdrawals started small, for $400 here, $200, $300 there, each one labeled in the transaction notes as loan or family matter or temporary. Then they grew, 3 transfers of $8 each. 1 transfer of $11,200 in a single afternoon. By month 11, my savings account was empty. He also took out a personal loan of $22,000 from a private lender in Atlanta, using my name, my social security number, my military pay stubs as proof of income, and my old Macon address. He listed himself as the emergency contact. So all payment notices went to him and never reached me. The monthly payments went unpaid for 6 months. By the time my boots touched American soil again, that loan was in collections, and my credit score had dropped 190 points from where it stood on the day I deployed. But those were not the worst things Kyle did while I was gone. The worst thing happened in March of my second deployment, 8 months before I came home. My grandmother, Ruth Harmon, died of a stroke in her sleep. She was 78 years old. She left behind a house that was paid off, a certificate of deposit worth $34 at her bank, a collection of jewelry that included pieces her own mother had left her, and a family trust she had arranged with an attorney named Carl Bridges on Forsyth Street in Macon. I could not come home for the funeral. My unit was mid-rotation and mid-operation. I submitted a formal request for emergency compassionate leave. It was denied for mission continuity reasons. I cried in my bunk for 20 minutes while the base continued its business around me. And then I went back to work, because that is what you do when the mission is the mission. If you are still with me right now, if you have ever had to keep moving while something inside you went quiet, hit that subscribe button before we go any further, because the rest of this story is for you. My grandmother's original will, written 4 years before her death, left the house to me. The CD was to be split equally between me and Kyle. Her jewelry was mine, with several specific pieces set aside for my mother. Kyle knew the contents of that will because my grandmother had told him. He had been present when she updated it with Mr. Bridges. What Kyle also knew, because he had been in Macon watching it happen, was that in the last year of her life, my grandmother had developed significant cognitive decline. She forgot names, she confused dates. She occasionally did not recognize faces she had known for decades. Her primary care physician had documented the deterioration across multiple appointments. While I was in Kandahar province with no phone access for weeks at a time, and no ability to monitor anything happening at home, Kyle drove my grandmother to a different attorney. A man named Darren Polk, who practiced out of a strip mall office on the south side of Macon, and who did not know our family history. Kyle had my grandmother sign a revised will. In the new document, the house went to Kyle. The full CD balance went to my mother. My name appeared once, next to the jewelry, and nowhere else. When the estate was settled, Kyle sold the house for $167,000 and deposited the proceeds into his personal account. My mother received the CD. Neither of them mentioned the revised document to me. When I emailed from overseas asking about my grandmother's arrangements in the weeks after her funeral, my mother wrote back, "We will talk when you are home." I did not know any of this until I landed at Hartsfield-Jackson, called my bank from inside the terminal, and heard a balance that made the noise of the entire airport disappear around me. People who have never served sometimes ask if combat was frightening. The honest answer is yes, in a specific way. Fear in a combat zone has a texture. It is fast and loud, and it demands immediate action. You move, you respond. You do what your training built you to do. The fear I felt in that airport was different. It was cold and quiet and total. It was the realization that the people who were supposed to be your base of operations, the people whose safety was part of what you were protecting while you served, had spent 15 months treating your absence as an opportunity. I did not scream. I did not call anyone. I stood next to a baggage carousel with my duffel bag at my feet and made a single decision. If they wanted to make me their target, they had chosen the wrong person, because I knew how to build a case. I spent the 9 days before the welcome home party doing exactly what the Army trained me to do. I gathered intelligence. I organized it. I prepared a file. I went to my bank in person and requested complete transaction records going back 2 years. I filed a formal fraud complaint regarding the personal loan and obtained every document the lender had on file. I called Mr. Carl Bridges, my grandmother's original attorney, and asked him to pull his records from her estate planning file. He confirmed the will he had drafted and told me he had never been contacted about any changes or revisions. A judge advocate general attorney I had worked alongside during my first deployment connected me with a civilian attorney in Atlanta named Sandra Okafor. who specialized in elder law and estate fraud. I sat in her office for 3 hours. She reviewed everything I brought. She used a phrase I had not heard before: undue influence. She said the revised will was contestable. She said the personal loan constituted fraud under federal statutes protecting service members. She said the unauthorized withdrawals, given the explicit language of the power of attorney I had kept on file, represented financial exploitation of a member of the armed forces. That phrase carried legal weight that I intended to use fully. I also called my cousin Angela. Angela lived 3 streets from my grandmother's house and had been close to her in those final months. She was the kind of honest that some people in families are, the kind who watch and remember but rarely speak, because nobody has ever thought to. Ask them. She called me back within an hour. She told me she had been present the day Kyle drove my grandmother across town to the office on the south side of Macon. She had not understood at the time what she was witnessing. She thought it was routine paperwork, but she remembered the date. She remembered the name on the attorney's door. She remembered that when she asked Kyle afterward what the meeting had been about, he told her he was taking care of Grandma's affairs while I was overseas. She said she was sorry. She said she should have asked more questions at the time. She agreed to write a sworn statement. That was the moment the folder became what I needed it to be. I organized everything the way I would organize an official investigation file. Clean section tabs, chronological order within each section, supporting documents placed behind each primary document, certified copies held with my attorney. What went into the accordion folder were carefully prepared duplicate packets, 14 of them, one for each adult who would be at that party. Clipped together, stacked inside the folder, placed inside the black nylon bag I had carried through 2 deployments. Kyle had 9 days to feel like he had won. I used every hour of them. The gathering was at my mother's house in Macon. About 20 people. Extended family, 2 neighbors who had known us since I was in middle school, and a couple of Kyle's colleagues from his real estate office who I had never met and whose presence I did not question. My mother had made her cornbread and a pot of chili. Bottles of sweet tea were lined up on the kitchen counter like soldiers. The sheet cake sat on the dining room table. Yellow frosting, a soldier silhouette. Reese Harmon, welcome home. Kyle gave a speech early in the evening. He stood beside the fireplace holding a cup of sweet tea, and he talked about sacrifice and service and how proud this family was to have a soldier in it. He talked, for a considerable stretch, about himself, about how difficult it had been to manage things at home while I was overseas, about the responsibility he had shouldered so I could focus on my mission. He used those exact words, managed everything at home, shouldered that responsibility. I smiled. I had placed the black nylon bag under my chair when I arrived. Nobody asked about it. One of Kyle's real estate colleagues assumed it was military gear and made a joke. I smiled at that too. When Kyle finished speaking, he raised his cup toward me and said, "To Reese, welcome home, soldier." I stood up. I thanked everyone for coming. I said I was grateful to be back on American soil, and that being in that room with the people I had thought about during 15 months overseas meant something real to me. I said I had spent a long time overseas thinking about what I would do when I got home, and that before the night ended, I wanted to share something with everyone present. Then I reached under my chair and picked up the bag. Kyle saw it. Something moved behind his eyes. Not panic yet, more like the moment before a man realizes the ground beneath him is not as solid as he assumed. I unzipped the bag, removed the accordion folder, and began distributing the individual packets around the room. One at a time. Every adult received one. I did not rush. I said there were 6 sections and I was going to walk through each one. The first section was the savings account. Read the balance aloud as it stood the day I deployed, and the balance as it stood the day I landed. I identified each of the 9 withdrawals by date, amount, and the note Kyle had entered in the transaction field. I showed the power of attorney document with the specific language defining emergency access. I showed his signature on the copy he had signed. Kyle said, "That is private information." I said, "So was my bank account." The second section was the personal loan. I showed the original application bearing a forged version of my signature. I showed the payment history documenting 6 consecutive missed months. I showed the collections notice that had been delivered to my mother's house, which she had never mentioned to me. I showed my current credit report with the 190-point decline highlighted and dated. My mother set down her cup of sweet tea. Kyle said there was an explanation for all of it. I said, Section 3 is the explanation I found. The third section was the estate. I showed the original will from Mr. Bridges, signed by my grandmother 4 years before her death. I showed the revised document obtained through estate records. I showed Angela's sworn statement. I showed 4 pages of my grandmother's medical records, documenting the onset and progression of her cognitive decline, beginning 14 months before the second document was signed. I showed the Georgia elder law definition of undue influence, printed on a clean page with the relevant statute number. Then I showed the letter. The letter was from my grandmother. She had written it 3 years before she died and left it in Mr. Bridges's file with instructions that it be given to me. She told me the house was mine and that she had always known I was the one who would build something lasting with it. She said she was proud of every choice I had made that other people did not understand. I read one line from it aloud. Just one, Reese. This house is yours. You are the one who always came home to me, even when home was the last thing on anyone else's mind. I did not read the rest. I did not need to. Kyle's wife Brenda was seated 2 chairs to his left. She had been reading quietly through her packet. When I finished with the estate section, she looked up at Kyle and said, "You told me that house was left to both of you equally. You said Reese agreed to let you sell it because she did not want to deal with property from overseas." Kyle said, "We will talk about this later." She said, "Kyle," he said, "Not now, Brenda." I said, "Section 4 might be a better time." The 4th section was the financial trail following the house sale, the $167,000 sale price, the deposit into Kyle's personal account, the $43 addition to his master bathroom 4 months later, the boat purchased in June, the vacation to Costa Rica in July, documented through receipts and public records. My Uncle David, who had been sitting with his arms crossed since the 2nd section, set his packet down on the coffee table. He looked at Kyle and said, "Son, what did you do?" Kyle pointed at me. "She is humiliating me in front of my own family," I said. "I am documenting what was done to me in front of the people who deserve to know the truth. The humiliation is a consequence, it is not the purpose." He looked around the room then, the way people look when they have been performing for an audience and suddenly need that audience to perform for them. He looked at the neighbors. He looked at his colleagues from the real estate office. He looked at our cousins, one of whom had her hand over her mouth. The people who had come to eat my mother's cornbread and toast a soldier's homecoming were now sitting inside a completely different kind of gathering, holding evidence packets, and not one of them was moving to help him. That stillness in the room, the absence of rescue, was its own kind of verdict. Brenda stood up from her chair. She did not storm out. She walked slowly to the kitchen and stood at the counter facing the window. Her hands were flat on the counter edge, and she was completely still. From where I sat, I could see the set of her shoulders, and I recognized it. It was the posture of someone absorbing something enormous and deciding.
Very quietly, what comes next?
The 5th section was the record of silence. Every message and email I had sent from overseas asking about my finances, my grandmother, the estate, or anything connected to the life I had left in their care, matched against every response I had received. My mother asking me to focus on staying safe. Kyle telling me everything was under control. My mother saying we would sort it all when I got home. 3 separate messages where I had asked direct questions about my savings account balance and received answers about the weather in Macon. 14 months of deliberate deflection, printed in chronological order on paper that did not have feelings about being read. My cousin Derek, who had been laughing along during Kyle's speech earlier, had stopped laughing well before this section. My Aunt Patricia was studying the floor. Nobody at that party looked comfortable anymore. The 6th section was my legal status summary, what my attorney had filed, what the Judge Advocate General Office had flagged under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, what the elder law violation meant for the estate under Georgia statute, the referral already submitted to the Georgia Attorney General's office. At the bottom, a single sentence in Sandra Okafor's letterhead. Based on the documentation provided, we are pursuing full recovery and criminal referral for all applicable violations. Kyle stood up. His voice came out too loud for the size of the room. "You brought lawyers into your own family," I said. "You brought fraud into your own family. I brought paperwork." He looked around the room the way people do when they have been performing for an audience and suddenly need that audience to rescue them. He looked at my mother. He looked at our uncle. He looked at the colleagues from his real estate office, who were probably reconsidering every decision that had brought them to this kitchen. Nobody moved. My mother was looking at her hands. Kyle turned to her. "Mom, tell her. Tell her how hard it was when you needed me, and she was gone halfway around the world. Tell her what I did to hold this family together." My mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Kyle, that is enough," he said. "You knew what I was doing. You benefited from it too," she said. Quieter, I said, "That is enough." That sentence cost her something real. I could see the weight of it. But it was the first honest thing spoken at that party. And it moved through the room the way a sound does, when it has been held too long before being released. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. I had prepared for it for 9 days, and I had expected something sharp and final, something that felt like completion. What I felt instead was grief. Grief for the grandmother whose house had been sold while I was on patrol in a province I will never forget. Grief for the version of homecoming I had imagined during the worst nights in Kandahar, where people were simply glad to see me and nobody had taken anything. Grief for the family I had served, in part, to protect. But underneath the grief was something quieter and more durable. Something that had been building across 9 days of motel rooms and attorney, offices and late nights with bank statements. I was done being owed. I zipped the accordion folder shut, placed it back in the nylon bag, and stood up. I said, "I did not come home to destroy this family. I came home because I was loyal. I came home because I believed that what I had given was being held carefully by people who cared about me. What I found when I got here is that my loyalty was being collected the way you collect from someone who does not know they are being taxed." Kyle said, "If you walk out that door right now, we are done." I looked at him. I said, "We were done when you signed my name." I looked at my mother one last time. She finally looked up from her hands. I said, "What he did with your silence wrapped around it. I do not know yet which one I will forgive first, but I know that forgiveness does not mean return." I said good night. I picked up the bag. I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped onto the porch. The September night in Macon was warm and thick the way Georgia nights always are. Crickets, a distant highway. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at something that had crossed its yard. I stood there for one breath and did not look back at the house. I could hear it through the walls, my mother's voice. Then Kyle's, too high and fast. Then Brenda's voice from the kitchen, flat and deliberate, asking a question he could not answer cleanly. Then I walked to my rental car and drove back to the motel where I had been staying since I landed, because I had known even before arriving that my mother's house was not a safe place to sleep. The consequences move the way consequences do when the paperwork is clean. Slowly at first, and then all at once. The personal loan was flagged under federal service member protection statutes. Kyle was required to pay full restitution, including accumulated fees and interest. The legal process left a mark on his credit that mirrored what he had done to mine across 15 months. He did not appreciate the symmetry. The estate case moved through mediation over 4 months. Proving undue influence requires a strong paper trail, and ours was not complete. But Angela's sworn statement, my grandmother's letter, the medical records, and the timing of the revised document made Kyle's position very difficult to hold. He agreed to a structured settlement of $89,000, less than the full value of what had been taken, significantly more than nothing. My credit was fully restored. My savings account was rebuilt through the settlement and through the financial discipline I had maintained since I was 18 years old, which had not disappeared simply because someone had tried to drain it. Kyle's real estate license came under review 6 months after the party when a client filed a complaint about documentation irregularities on a separate transaction. I did not initiate that process. I only answered questions honestly when the investigator reached out. Brenda filed for separation before Thanksgiving. She told Angela that the cumulative picture of Kyle's financial activity during my deployment had made certain things she had been explaining away for years impossible to continue explaining. The documentation did not give her new information, so much as it made denial no longer available as an option. My mother called 17 times the first month. I answered twice. Both times she said she had not understood the full scope of what Kyle was doing, had told herself it was not her place to intervene. I told her that choosing not to look at something is not the same as not knowing, that choosing silence in the presence of harm is a form of participation. She said that was a hard thing to hear. I told her hard things had stopped frightening me, somewhere between my first and second deployment. My Uncle David called me once, about 3 weeks after the party. He said he owed me an apology. He said he had always assumed Kyle was the steady one, the one who had it together, and that he had not looked closely enough at the truth, sitting right beside him. It was a short call, and neither of us tried to extend it, but he said the words clearly and he meant them. I thanked him because it was the right thing to do, and because honest apologies are rarer than people think. Nobody else called. She mailed me a letter in November, 4 pages. The first 2 were apology. The third was context and explanation. The fourth was a question about the holidays. I wrote back a single sentence: I need time, and you need to use it. I spent the holidays in Northern Virginia, where I had accepted a position with a federal contractor doing compliance and security work that used the skills the Army had built in me. My apartment was small and orderly, and mine. A coffee maker I had chosen, a bedroom that stayed quiet, a gym in the building where I could run at 5 in the morning without anyone needing anything from me. I adopted a dog from a rescue organization, a 4-year-old black lab named Sergeant, who had been released from a police K-9 training program because he was more interested in tennis balls than tracking anything. We understood each other completely. I found a therapist who worked specifically with veterans. Not my first attempt at therapy, but the first time I had found someone who understood what it meant to love a mission and also grieve everything that mission cost. We worked through the deployments. We worked through the homecoming. We worked through the complicated grief of recognizing that a family you served to protect had treated your absence as access. I want to say something plainly before this story ends. I do not believe what I did was cruel. I believe it was accurate. There is a difference between cruelty and accountability, and the difference is documentation and intention. I did not exaggerate anything in those 6 sections. I did not dramatize or embellish. I printed what existed, and I placed it in front of the people who needed to see it. If what existed was devastating, that is because they had built something devastating and assumed I would never come home with the skills and the steadiness to name it. They underestimated what 7 years of military service does to a person. It does not make you cold. That is the misunderstanding people carry about veterans, especially about women who serve, especially about women from families that doubted them from the beginning. The assumption is that the uniform took something soft from you and left something harder and less feeling in its place. What the uniform gave me was precision, the ability to feel something completely while continuing to function. The ability to carry grief and anger and love all at the same time and still place one foot in front of the other. Still file the paperwork. Still show up. Still hold the line. I was hurt by what they did. I was furious. On the 3rd night at 2 in the morning, I found the line that broke me. A transfer from my first deployment in $800, labeled emergency. Love you, sis. Sent the exact same week, Kyle posted a video about family loyalty that had gotten 4,000 views and 73 comments, calling him a real one. I set the bank statement down on the motel desk. I pressed both palms flat against the surface. I breathed through my nose the way they train you to breathe when you need to stay present and not go somewhere else entirely. The motel AC hummed. Outside, a car passed. My hands were shaking. I had not noticed until I tried to pick up the pen. I sat like that for a while, not crying, not thinking, just sitting with the shape of it. Then I picked up the statement again, placed it in the tab, and kept going. But I did not stop. I did not call anyone to scream. I did not post anything. I filed, I documented, I organized. I walked into that living room steady, and I walked out the same way. Sergeant was waiting at the motel when I got back that night. He lifted his head when the door opened, wagged his tail once with great professional restraint, and went back to sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and let myself breathe. Somewhere in Macon, my brother's night was coming apart. Somewhere, Brenda was sitting with a clearer picture of her marriage than she had walked into that party with. Somewhere, my mother was at her kitchen table trying to understand what had just happened to her family. I was in a motel room with a lab and a legal case I had already won, and the quiet knowledge that I had done exactly what I came home to do. Not to punish anyone, to close the accounting, to name what had happened and ensure that the people who needed to know it could no longer claim they did not. Here is what I know now that I wish someone had told me before the first deployment, before the first transfer I sent home, before the first time I said yes to something that should have been a no, because it was family. and no felt like abandonment. Service is not the same as submission. I gave 7 years to a country I believed in, and I have no regrets about that. I gave smaller pieces of myself to a family I believed loved me back, and I have complicated feelings about that which I am still sorting through. On Tuesday afternoons in a therapist office in Northern Virginia. What I do not have is shame. The records I kept, the case I built, the folder I carried into that room, none of it was unusual for who I am. I am someone who was trained to document, to build cases, to hold lines under pressure. The only thing that changed on that September night was that I stopped directing those skills outward and turned them toward my own protection. I should have done it sooner. I understand that now. If you have spent years giving to people who never asked how you were doing, only how much you had available, I want to say something to you directly. There is a version of loyalty that becomes exploitation the moment it stops being chosen, the moment it is simply assumed, the moment someone else's budget includes your silence as a line item. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to keep records. You are allowed to name what happened in a room full of witnesses. And you are allowed to walk out the front door, drive to a motel, sit in the dark with a dog who does not know or care about any of it, and feel for the first time in a very long time, like you are not surviving something, like you are simply breathing. I still think about my grandmother on quiet mornings when the light comes through my apartment windows, and Sergeant is snoring in the corner, and nobody needs anything from me. I think about the blue church hat she wore to my enlistment ceremony, how she made biscuits and honey and sat across from me and said I had more courage in my left hand than most people carried in their whole bodies. I think she would have approved of the folder. She was a woman who believed in doing things right and naming things true. She left me that house because she knew I would use it to build something real. The settlement money went toward the down payment on a small house in Northern Virginia, with a yard large enough for Sergeant to patrol to his own satisfaction. She was right about me. I am still building. The last message I received from Kyle came 8 months after the party. No apology. No acknowledgement of anything in that folder. Just 3 words sent from a number I had not yet blocked. Was it worth it? I stared at it for a long moment. Then I typed back 4 words, every single page. Then I blocked the number. Some doors, once you have walked through them clearly and cleanly, do not need to stay open behind you. Before you go, I want to ask you one thing. Has someone in your life ever called themselves family while treating you like a resource? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. And if any part of this story reached you tonight, share it with one person who needs to hear that they are allowed to come home. Thank you for watching this story all the way through. Everything you have just heard is fictional and was created entirely for entertainment and storytelling purposes. But if any part of it felt familiar, if you have ever given more than you had and received silence and assumption in return, I hope it reminded you of something true. You are allowed to keep records. You are allowed to name what happened. You are allowed to hold the line. And you are absolutely, unquestionably allowed to come home.